yeah, happy to be back and share some thoughts on entrepreneurship and HCI. So before we get started, I'll just do a few acknowledgements. So the first, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is a traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg people. Obviously, we're virtual, but it's still very important to acknowledge the Indigenous population of Canada. And last but not least, since I did a lot of my PhD as well in Calgary, and I'm also currently in Calgary right now, working remotely, I'd like to acknowledge the Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot nations, including the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, and Tsuut'ina Nation, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. We acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. So now that that's out of the way, I guess the point of today's workshop is to really sort of think about how to think like an entrepreneurial researcher. And so in this sort of workshop, I'm going to explain to you at the beginning, at least, sort of how I got to where I am now in terms of my thinking, both when I started as a student as well as kind of like now. So quick bit about me, if you didn't attend last week. So I'm currently a senior researcher at Microsoft Research. I lead sort of the Future of Wearables mini group. So anything on the body, around the body, that's kind of the research that I do. I did an entrepreneurial PhD in computer science in Canada as well. And really what that meant is I did a number of startups in my PhD as part of my research. So before I jump into a lot of other things, I'll just quickly sort of give you a high level overview of really what entrepreneurial thinking is about. And I mean, obviously there's a nice long quote, but really the thing that I've highlighted is that you kind of see things differently or think of things differently than basically normal, right? And I mean, nowadays, so when I made this slide, this was, I guess, early in my PhD, and it was always about seeing things differently. I guess now that I'm farther along in my career, really it's just about the way you think is very disruptive, or you look at something and you want to change it somehow or some way, and that might be disruptive. And so in the way I think now is kind of like this. So on one side, I have research, and on one side, I have entrepreneurship. And the research side, usually it's very multidisciplinary. So, I mean, the work that I do at Microsoft, for example, sometimes it's in gaming, sometimes it's in education, sometimes it's in fashion, sometimes it's in wearables. But I'm also doing a bit of software, hardware design, and UX, but that's purely research, and I'm not really focused on making product. While on the other side, I might do things that are much more product driven. So for example, always working with the customer to create something. And obviously there's a nice sort of I guess, back and forth between the two. There's also a very nice dichotomy as well. So this is kind of how I think nowadays, where there's one side that's I'm doing specific things, and there's another side where it's very product driven, and sometimes it can overlap. So if you remember this slide from last week, this was, or a couple weeks ago, this was sort of my PhD. There was a phase where I was working for startups, then also a phase of building startups, and then there was specific research areas. But for the purposes of today, I'm only really going to focus on the startup side. And as you can tell, when I worked for startups, it was oil and gas at the very beginning. Then I did a number of different things on building side. So the first one I'll talk about next is sort of Slate Scale. That was more in the healthcare, health industry, and fitness industry. And then the one after it is going to be the Stitch Kit, which is the STEAM education one. The reason I picked these two in my sort of timeline of entrepreneurship is Slate is basically at the very beginning of my, I guess, entrepreneurial journey, minus working for a startup. And then the STEAM education one is very much, I'd say, towards the end of the PhD, where I sort of learned a bunch of stuff in between the two things. So it's a nice like beginning and I would say middle point of where I was. So first thing I'm going to play to you is the Slate Scale. So Slate Scale is as you'll see in the next video, is a basically like Fitbit for measuring food. And this was the first hardware project I had done, regardless of research or entrepreneurship. Let me play this.
This is Slate. Slate is the world's first portable nutritional smart scale that tracks anything you eat with pinpoint accuracy. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with high cholesterol, which was quite a shock because I go to the gym 3 or 4 times a week and I thought I ate healthy. It turns out what I thought was healthy food was in fact quite the opposite. Nutrition and diet make up 80% of the weight loss equation. So I needed something simple yet accurate to track what I eat on a day-to-day basis. That's when I thought of Slate. Our goal from the start was to bring the same level of accuracy to nutrition that already exists with fitness and activity tracking. go for a run, you know the exact distance down to the very last step, how fast you go, and the number of calories you burn. With Slate, you get a full breakdown of what's on your plate by tapping into a database of thousands of food items. Simply pair your smartphone, add your items, and Slate will give you a simple breakdown of information from calories to macronutrients. Whether you're trying to balance your diet, keep better track of calories, or just want a better understanding of what you're eating, Slate can help.
So when we were designing Slate in the application, there are a few key things that we wanted to do. We wanted the Slate to be extremely portable and easy to use. There's one button for power and it automatically pairs with your smartphone. It also has a tare function, so if you're using a plate or planning on weighing multiple food items, it'll give you accuracy all the way through. Most people tend to eat similar items day to day. Slate will recognize this. So the more you use it, the less manual entries are needed. The battery lasts about a month on a single charge, so you'll never really have to find yourself hugging the wall. Slate also offers you personalized recipes based on your personal calorie target goals.
It also has a barcode scanner for packaged foods that instantly accesses a database full of products. We're also planning to integrate Slate with existing apps and wearables like Fitbit and MyFitnessPal, so you will never have to enter in anything twice.
When it comes to health and wellness, striking a balance is the key to success. We know that weight loss is 80% nutrition and only 20% exercise. So why is it that we spend so much time tracking every single step we take in a day, but yet we don't give a second thought to our nutrition and the calories that go along with it? We should be putting more focus on tracking our nutrition in order to get the meaningful results that we want.
So over the last year, we made a number of iterations and versions of the Slate scale, but we finally arrived at one that's ready for production. First, we need your help.
By backing us, you will be one of the first people to get your hands on the Slate scale and experience a simpler and smarter way to track what you eat. We won't force you, but if you think Slate is cool, feel free to share with your friends and family. We encourage you to back our campaign today. Thanks for watching. This.
Yep. So that was, I guess, Slate scale. So that was sort of the first project that I worked on outside of research that was purely just of interest in me trying to learn. So this was the first time I had done anything outside of software. So most of the time, as a researcher, I was building multi-display environments. So in environments that have a number of screens and sensors. So I was really focused on that. So this was the first time I'd done anything related to hardware. And you're probably wondering, like, as a student, how do you go from, not doing that to doing that? Well, basically how this happened was, I showed up at a makerspace. One day I was just trying to learn, some 3D printing skills and things like that. Ran into Rana, who was really interested in building something. And then over the course of a year, we ended up, building this thing for real. So what that meant was trying to find things in China, doing marketing, all these different tasks. So I'll go over that in a second. So a few things that I learned were the following. So, let's say you're a new student and you maybe don't necessarily have the skills, and that's one of the challenges of entrepreneurship is you might have a limited skill set, or you might be really good at one thing but not at other things. Makerspaces are actually great for that type of thing. Being able to go out and meet people with skills other than yourself was really cool, and for me it was great because this was sort of the first time I had done anything related to like industrial grade 3D printing or shipping, all that type of stuff. It was also good for me learning, electronics. And I didn't do electronics at this time yet. This was sort of the first introduction to it, at least at a consumer product level. And then one of the other things we did too was we started making plans for working backwards and forwards. So, for example, we made plans if this thing was succeeding on Indiegogo or Kickstarter, what would we be doing? And if it didn't, what would we not be doing? And then things like, when we wanted to ship this, how much would we have to order? And things like that. The other thing we learned was manufacturing is very, very hard. We made, over the course of a year, it took us 1 year to make basically 2 versions of this scale that worked properly. And it was not easy. So it's not an easy thing to make hardware, was one of the main lessons at early stage in my PhD. This is probably one of the more interesting things that I learned, and I still take it with me today, is that find something similar if you can. So over the course of the year, what we did is we contacted a couple of manufacturers in China that were building basically smaller scales. And so we're trying to come up with something new. And over the course of the year, we realized actually there's a number of companies that make something very similar. So instead of us coming up and spending all this money and time trying to make something new, could we modify something that already existed? And so what we did is we went on, Alibaba. We found a number of companies that had really small, interesting scale prototypes, and we asked them to modify their designs at minimal cost. So what that means is you spend way less time trying to make a piece of hardware or something practical, because the ecosystem already kind of exists for it, whether it's the manufacturing, the chipsets that you need, et cetera, et cetera. So the quickest way to do something like this for slate scale, especially now knowing what I know now, is to find something that's very similar and see how quickly you can modify it, or how quickly manufacturing can modify it. And it saves you a ton of time. And the last but not least was, we also learned we should just pay for things if we can. Obviously myself was a student, and Rana was also, sort of early on in his career. So we didn't have the hugest, I would say, budget. So we took on a lot of roles. We took on, I did a lot of the software development. I did a bit of firmware development. Rana did a lot of marketing, a lot of business plan work. But what we found was, between the two of us, some things, we're just not good at. So for me, for example, marketing is just not my thing. It really isn't. But we found that it's probably better for us to pay for some things like that. So in the case of marketing, we found when we were doing our Indiegogo campaign, and we sort of realized this later, if you want to get media, for example, you need to get media months in advance, versus doing everything ad hoc, which is kind of what we did at the very end, where we launched our campaign and then tried to get media. It should have been beforehand. So paying for things like that, was ideal. So this project wasn't necessarily successful in the sense that we didn't raise all of our money on Indiegogo. We only raised about almost 30,000 out of the 50,000 that we asked. But we did a number of pitch competitions, and so we didn't really lose any money per se, but other than time. But it was a very valuable lesson to learn, what it takes to actually make something. So this is the first example of me like, okay, maybe this is not too hard. So then obviously I did a number of different startups after, in a number of different areas, but then the next one I'll talk about is, I guess, StitchKit. One of the other things I'll mention too for Slate is we did this on Indiegogo, and the next one you'll see StitchKit was on Kickstarter. One of the reasons why is if you're doing, hardware especially, or making something and you want to sell it, where you're selling it matters. So Indiegogo at the time didn't really factor too much into the currency issue, right? So, if you pay for something and you might order, say 100 at a certain currency, and you need to sell it back, you need to make sure that you're not going to get dinged on the currency difference. So Kickstarter, for example, will charge you in a certain currency, and you will lose money, versus Indiegogo, which doesn't really care, depending on your location. So that was kind of the reason why we went with Indiegogo there. But StitchKit, on the second hand, that one was a bit more successful, partially maybe because of the platform, but also because we learned a bunch of stuff from before. So I'll play that video next. Okay.
This is StitchKit. It's a product that we developed to make technology more accessible and allow you to be creative in ways that you didn't know was possible.
StitchKit is a perfect thing for anyone to start running and making their own wearable technology, because it has all the components to create whatever you need to. All you need is some fabric and you can get started.
The kit will include the board, LED strips, sensors, 3D printed diffusers, and all the wires necessary for the completion of the piece.
You do not need a programming background. You do not need an electronics background.
The StitchKit is going to be the first big fashion board that will be easy to use by everybody, from students to professionals.
You can take technology and enhance the human form. You can give people superhuman powers. And that's, that's pretty cool. It used to be, something we saw on the TV screen or at the movies, but now we can do it and turn ourselves into superhumans.
We all have the potential to be able to create really cool technological things, and Stitch Kit really makes those things accessible. So that's why I'm really excited about it.
Until last year, there was probably very little technology besides the use of our everyday sort of sewing machines and equipment, until we did the sort of a partnership with Make Fashion, and they brought in a whole new world of wonderful technology to learn to incorporate technology into wearable garments.
I think getting more and more people into it and more telling their story and saying how easy it really is can really help people be like, oh, if they can do it,
If we can do it,
then I think I can do it,
because we knew nothing going into it, and we just completely picked it up.
So I think Stitch Kit is really awesome because it allows people to create wearable tech and fashion tech pieces far easier and far faster than ever would have done before.
For us, fashion tech has been a powerful experience in shaping not just the future of the field, but also as a way to empower those around us and create a meaningful and lasting community. We hope you can join us.
So as you can tell, this is a bit different than the first project, I guess, that you saw in Indiegogo, where it was a sort of slate scale. Now I'm switching more to STEM education. And it's a bit more refined now, the pitch too, if you've kind of noticed, where there's a specific customer we're aiming for, there's a specific goal, and I think generally it's kind of more refined. And as I mentioned, and you probably saw a couple weeks ago, this one was actually successful, and we raised 30,000 of our 10,000 goal. Now there's a couple of things here as to why it's 10,000 versus 50,000 you saw earlier. So one of the things, we learned, or especially me anyways, is that you're not really going to make money on sort of crowdfunding campaigns. The point of a crowdfunding campaign really is to prove out a market. So the first case, you kind of saw you're trying to make money to make the thing, versus now where the ask is very low because we have a lower ask, and really it's about marketing. Can we validate the market and the idea, which is kind of why the ask is so low here. So this is kind of a trick that you can do to game the system a little bit, where you have a lower ask on Indiegogo or Kickstarter to basically make sure you get 100% and look successful. So, and again, like even looking back now with what you saw with Slate Scale, the ask was very high because at the time, that was sort of the first interaction I had dealing with manufacturers in Asia and sort of figuring that out. Whereas now the ask is much lower because there's a bit of experience with hardware. We can lower the cost of what it costs to make it, which means our ask is lower on Indiegogo. So, I mean, that's part of the reason why this was a bit more successful the second time. So I'll go over a couple of examples of things that I learned, very much like the last one. So the first is, and I kind of mentioned this a couple weeks ago as well, is that, making hardware sustainable is hard. So for every thing you add to your kit or your package or your hardware or even your software, there's going to be other costs. And as I mentioned the last couple weeks ago, if we add in way too many components, the box size changes. If the box size changes, then the weight changes. And if the weight changes, then you can fit less on a pallet. And if you have a bigger pallet, then it costs more to ship it. So everything has a cost to it. And again, I mentioned a couple weeks ago as well, timing was everything. We rushed this product a little bit in terms of, we launched it around Christmas time, where probably it should have been during school, like before school starts, so September or late October. And then the other thing too was the after is actually much harder than the before. So it's a lot of work to, to make the video, to find, do all the crowdfunding, make all the graphics, do the nice videos I mentioned, find the right components, do all the software. That is one state of work. But this thing that's actually hard is after, like, how do you sustain the thing so it's a viable business beyond what you do? Because as I mentioned, crowdsourcing is not really a way you're going to make money. It's going to hopefully validate your idea, but even then it's going to validate it to an extent. You're going to find people that are very passionate about your project or product, and they're going to be the first backers, but what about everybody else? How do you convince them? So for me, it was more, this isn't really the way to make revenue, but it might be a good way to prove out an idea. And then the last but not least, and I guess this is kind of why we're not doing Stitch Kit nowadays anyways, is it a feasible business? Because So let's take the stitch kit, for example. The cost of it, was pretty high, and the margins are very low for every component or every LED strip or even the board. So putting it all together, that's a bit of work in and of itself. So if you removed any money that you would make and just purely focused on the sales of the kit, the margin wasn't very high to begin with. But then when you add in the cost of labor and your time or my time, for example, even when you're a student, your time costs money. So factoring all that in, it really begged the question, is this a feasible business? And so you kind of get lured into, you're doing a Kickstarter campaign, it hits 100%, but what about after? Is it really going to work? And sometimes you need to be able to walk away from it. And so that's kind of what we did. Now, the next thing I'll talk about is, so you've seen me at sort of the beginning and kind of more towards the end of or middle-ish of PhD. But what is the secret sauce that makes me think this way, that lets me do this type of thing or work with others that can work like this way? And that secret is called the lean canvas. So the lean canvas is a really quick way of doing a business plan without doing all of the crazy amount of work that you have to do. You still think of the same things, whether what the problem is, what the solution is, who the customers are and how you're going to make money. But the nice thing about this is if you think of your projects in this way, at least at the very beginning, you can really frame a lot of what you do later. So before you go talk to a VC or venture capitalist, or before you talk to someone for funding in the government or even in a local sort of government level, having this in mind for me has always helped quite a bit. And so I learned this lean canvas quite early in my PhD, and it sort of influences how I think even now. So at a very high level, I'm going to show you guys what this is and walk through it, and then you guys are actually going to go through doing one yourselves with some startup ideas. So don't get alarmed with what it looks like now, and I'll walk through it at a high level. So it's very much a canvas, and you basically fill in each thing one by one. So first section is kind of the customers, so I'll walk through that now. So the first thing you're going to fill out is customers, right? So let's say you have an interesting startup idea. So let's take Slight Scale, for example. Customer segments. Who's my target customer, and who's going to adopt it early? Well, the people that are going to adopt it early are probably the people that are really into fitness, really into food tracking, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the customer segment in general is going to be people that are interested in fitness and health tracking. Maybe it's people that are interested in Fitbit or use devices like that. So then it's first is thinking about the customer. Then, oh, that didn't work correctly. Okay, yeah. So next it's what's the problem you're trying to solve. So putting in 2 to 3 problems. 3 problems that you think your thing will solve. So for us, it was food tracking. It was giving out accurate recipes, and it was just general health is what we're trying to solve. And then you have to think about existing alternatives. So what else are people doing with that? So there's already a couple of examples of things that track food. There was MyFitnessPal, and there was one other at the time that was doing it. So already you're getting who is this thing for and what am I trying to solve? So if you think about research, you're kind of doing that most of the time anyways, right? When you think of a research project, so let's say I'm doing a research project on, let's say I want to make like a new 3D printer. And so obviously I'm going to have to do some research as to who is going to use it and who wants to use it and what challenges are going to be there. That's problems, right? And who's going to use it and who am I going to interview? That's customer segments. So already there's an overlap between research and entrepreneurship as it is. Next, you're going to think about revenue streams. So how's this thing going to make money? Where's the money coming from? So in the case of Slight Scale, it would have been things like the sale of the hardware, or it might have been ads in the application, or maybe it's if we made a custom API that allowed us to stream recipe information that was meaningful and provide that information to other companies that were interested in looking at what people wanted to eat. That's another source of revenue, right? So thinking about how you're going to make money with that thing. Then you're going to look at what the solution is. So what's the solution going to look like? In the case of Slight Scale, we were like, okay, maybe a food tracking scale that works with your phone would be a really nice solution. Pulls in information from the cloud on recipes and things like that, and then it also ties into how we can make revenue. So it ties all in together. Next, you need to think about what makes your thing unique, right? What is the thing that makes it special, right? So you notice in the pitch for Slight Scale, we had it's Fitbit for food, right? So that's what the high level concept is. So there's X for Y, right? So Fitbit for food. And this is the thing you basically think of your project as. if you think of research side, we do this too, right? And when you write an introduction for a paper for Kai, for example, the last paragraph or 2 paragraphs to basically describe what makes your thing unique, what makes it different. So again, we already have kind of a tie to research. Next, we think about channels. So this is how are you going to get to your customers? So in the case of SateScale, we already knew that there's a fitness crowd and there's a huge Fitbit crowd. So how are we going to get to it? So for us, channels meant, we're going onto forums, we're using social media, and we're going to reach influencers to reach our customers. So how are you going to get the thing in front of the people that need to see it the soonest? Next, you need to think of key metrics. So how are we going to track how your business is doing? So in the case of SlateScale, what we did there was when we launched our Kickstarter or our Indiegogo campaign, and even the one with StitchKit, we had Google metrics going, so we knew how many people were watching our videos, where the clicks were coming from. So we had a nice breakdown almost every day of, where the interest was coming for our product. And it's important to have this because then you can also tweak what's working, what isn't working in your sort of concept or startup. Next, then sort of cost structure. So then you need to think a little bit about what the things are going to cost. So in SlateScale, when we did this, we thought a lot about, okay, so what's the salary going to be for 2 of us or even 3 of us if we need to add another person? And what's the cost going to be for shipping? What's the cost going to be for hosting the app? What's the cost going to be for like professional app development? Because at the time, I was just a student and you don't really know how to build full-scale deployable apps for thousands of people. So all these different costs we had to think about. And then obviously, is this thing going to make money over time and be viable? And last but not least, and sometimes this is the hardest thing, what is the thing that makes it unique? What makes you like special compared to other apps or things like that? So in the case of machine learning things, for example, it might be an algorithm that you can do that nobody else can't. So next, so hopefully that makes sense. And to sort of frame this a bit more, I'll show you what YouTube looks like in this lean canvas way. So let's take a look at YouTube. So this is their lean canvas from 2005. So let's look at customer segments, right? So customer segments might be people that are mass market users, people that are video bloggers, advertisers. You want to use the platform. The people that are probably going to use it the earliest are teenagers, people that are really young, college students, video hobbyists, filmmakers. What's the problem? There is no hosting video as a service. So at the time there was no YouTube, right? So the video really wasn't hosted anywhere. There might have been Vimeo, Google Video, and some other things. And what was our channel to get into these people? It was friends, founder friends, email contests, trying to get as many people as they can to use it up front, right? What was the solution? Develop a website just for amateur videos, which is really what YouTube was at the very beginning, right? And what made it unique was that it was, they called it the next Flickr video, right? It was watch and share video on a single thing and have ratings for it, which was unique at the time. Right. So then they made this website, and obviously the cost structure was things around hosting. Where's the information going to be hosted? It's going to scale over time. In 2005 might not be as much, but now it's what, 2020, and they have billions of users. So obviously the hosting is going to scale up, and then you need payroll and development. And then obviously they wanted to keep track of things. So how many people are watching videos? Their stickiness. So how many people are actually continuing to watch the thing? The revenue streams are things like investment. So for example, if they were new and you're new and you don't have a lot of revenue coming in, you can also consider revenue as the number of people that invest in your idea. But obviously had advertising and then Google bought it. So that obviously worked out really well. And so their unfair advantage, which is again, the last thing, but probably the hardest, obviously they were sort of unique at the time, was it's really hard to recreate video hosting on a large scale, especially since they were at Google. So to do that type of thing was very hard at the time. And then also users of this video hosting pushed other users to join this network. So they were sort of the first to have this social aspect to their video platform as well. But this is sort of a nice example of what a $1 billion lean canvas looks like. Part of the reason why I like the lean canvas is it gets you started. Right? It's not going to be the end game, right? Because eventually you're going to have to make a business plan, and eventually you're going to have to pitch to VCs. So this, for me, is like a really nice way to think of most of the things all the way through from the very beginning. Then you fill in what's missing. Right. So at least in the case of the StitchKit stuff, I didn't do this as much at that time because it's sort of very new to it. whereas more towards the end with StitchKit, it really became, so let's say, for example, the channels was kind of sort of easy to define. The problem we kind of understood really well. It was the cost structure and revenue stream that came into play later, right? Where we were producing, like we did 1 to 7 just fine, right? And then 8 and 9 were like, oh my lord, all right. So for example, with StitchKit, I mean, lots of people can make hardware, so what makes it unique? That was a challenge, and even the cost structure that was also a challenge, right? Like we didn't. I mean, as I mentioned before, hardware is hard, right? Every decision you make in terms of shipping something becomes a challenge, which is something you work through as you do it, basically. So I guess, yeah, let's just chat a little bit about what you guys learned, what you thought about the lean canvas, what you thought worked, what didn't work. I mean, I kind of want to hear your thoughts first. And you can ask me some questions as well.
I mean, first and foremost, I think it's a good way to kind of maybe structure your initial thoughts, right? Being able to identify kind of what challenges you might be facing with and what type of work needs, like how the work could be spread across like a team by looking at it for the big picture and seeing, okay, well, maybe I'm maybe a better specialist in this area. I have connections in this area so that I could tackle these areas. But it also gives you that whole kind of picture, right, in terms of where you're going to be, because becomes very timely and consuming if you start thinking some of these considerations a lot later on after you've put all this time and investment in. So it's just giving you a better way to kind of plan over the long term of what you're planning on doing. And I certainly think it's challenging to think of all those things like right off the bat.
Yep.
I could definitely see something like this kind of evolving over time, like as you get more immersed in the kind of work, some of these considerations become a lot more apparent. And so then I think it needs kind of like an iterative process over time. Yep,
absolutely. I mean, even in the 2 that we've done so far, we kind of iterated them on them, right? In just 1 session. So it's not supposed to be a static document. It will change over time as your business changes, right? I mean, for example, if you did a lean canvas for something that was about education before COVID, it's probably different after COVID, now that everything's remote, right? So
absolutely.
It's just, it changes over time, but yeah, you're right. Totally right. Anybody else? Does anyone have any questions for me on some of the stuff that I've done with Lean Canvas and things I've learned? Or just questions in general?
What's your next step after you create this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually so let's talk about Calgary specifically, right? So usually, let's say you have an idea, like maybe you want to build an app or you want to build a piece of hardware and you don't have any funding, right? So typically what people do, at least in this area, is they work on a lean canvas. And the lean canvas, as Ariane mentioned, it's really good to get your thoughts and framing and discussion. So you finish the lean canvas, then I think you're basically ready to go and talk to someone because you've sort of logically thought through at least most things, what you want to do and how you want to approach it and sort of the end game. From there, usually, you talk to someone, whether it's a VC or someone who gives you funding. And probably the first thing they're going to ask for is a business plan. But instead of doing a business plan, you can probably show them this lean canvas. And the lean canvas, if you fill it out correctly over a period of time, you can effectively translate that to a business plan that semi makes sense. And also, what's really nice with the lean canvas is you can probably copy and paste most of the stuff into a lot of the grant forms because they ask these exact same questions. Just maybe not in the same order and not the same wording, but it's the same sort of process. From there, you can probably get some funding, then actually build the thing over time, ideally.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So like for the lean canvas, do you only build it in the beginning of the project or you do it like at each of the stage? Because I found it quite a good like template to go over the whole project, the structure, or say to conclude what have been done and what should be done in the next stage.
Yeah, I mean, typically you want to do it at the very beginning of the project, right? Because you're defining a lot of the different things, right? You're doing a startup, right? So you need to plan moving forward for a startup. That being said, it does change over time too, right? So even if things change, you're gonna change the document. I mean, it is a good question, right? Like you could, I mean, conceivably, if you're doing a business, I would hope at some point you would have a business plan beforehand. But if you didn't, I mean, it would be good. I mean, it wouldn't hurt to do a lean canvas and maybe rethink about what the direction of everything is too.
Yeah.
That's a great question. It's a great question.
So Kyle's asked, do you think a lean canvas can be used to analyze your competitors to see what they are able to offer and then find your niche from that?
Well, yes, that's a great question. So if you remember in the solutions slide, there's a subsection that talks about competitors. You're going to be doing competitive analysis in some shape or form as part of lean canvas, if you're doing it correctly. I mean, we only spent about an hour or so on it, right? But yes, that is part of the point of this, is to find out what other people are doing. And even for myself, yeah, I look heavily into what other people are doing before I do anything, to figure out what makes my thing unique. Because in order to answer the question of what is the unique value proposition, you need to know what's unique from everybody else. There's a few more questions. Yeah, no problem, Kyle.
So Teddy, you mentioned earlier to talk to someone, and you said BC, and it's the second or third time that you've mentioned it, but I apologize. I don't know what it stands for.
Oh, VC, it's a venture capitalist.
Okay.
Those are the people that are investors. They're basic investors. Just think of it
Like
as
Dragon's Den.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, which is, and for venture capitalists and I guess for investors, a lot of it comes down to you have a good idea, you have a semi-solid plan, and the lean canvas definitely helps with that. I can speak from experience, but also the team that you have is also quite important as well. So there can be I mean, there's a stat where it's like 99% of startups fail, right? Most things fail, but the ones that succeed have a good idea and also have a really good team. And sometimes team is actually more important than the idea itself. So I watched a video a couple of weeks ago of Steve Jobs, and he was talking about how he was building Apple, and he was basically saying, like, their secret to some of their success early on, especially with the early Macs, was the fact that they had a really good team, and he just made sure that he had a really good team, and he didn't care what they were building. As long as the team was good, he knew they were going to deliver something innovative, right? And it's the same thing with startups, where I've been on some really good teams, and we've done some pretty crazy stuff, and then some other teams where like the idea was good, but we just didn't execute because the team wasn't good. So yeah, that's and that is one aspect that VCs measure you on as well. So it's not just business, but also the team side.
I have another question in regards to one of your products that you'd made, the Stitch one.
Yep.
You said that you ended up leaving it behind. What were some of the factors after the backing that led you to believe that that it wasn't able to be done?
Yeah. So, I mean, so one of the things I mentioned before is like so this is the trick with Indiegogo and Kickstarter, right? You can, like, it's sort of a marketing thing. Like, you're not really going to make money off it. So what you want to do with Kickstarter and Indiegogo is actually you want to make sure your thing's successful, because if you're successful on Indiegogo or Kickstarter, then you get picked up by the media or other places, because people always want to report on something positive. So they'll say, oh yes, this campaign was 100% funded, 200% funded. It looks nice. It's a nice headline, et cetera, et cetera. That only gets you so far, right? So that got us, they got us pretty far in terms of the sales, and you guys kind of saw the map, and that was pretty good. The problem was after we got all that initial bump off Kickstarter and Indiegogo, then it came a question of like, how are we actually going to sell this, right? So then we were sitting in our office in Calgary. We had like several hundred boxes of stuff that we ordered, and it was just a slog to sell it. It's easy to get all the press, but then delivering it was pretty hard, because then we're just shipping to a number of different countries. And because we didn't have like a full-size pallet of stuff, then it meant we were getting dinged on shipping it one by one. Right? And what we wanted was like a giant order, and then sort of ship that out. So there was that aspect. Then there's the fact that like the amount of time it took from us to do all this work, the more we would have had to charge way more for the kits. But the thing is, it's for education, right? So you don't want to overcharge it. So there's this notion of like, there's the business side and there's like the philanthropy side, right? And so that was a tough thing to balance. And then just, yeah, the margins weren't super high. So then we tried to pivot into like, okay, maybe we focus purely on software and we don't really worry about like the hardware side. So maybe we come up with some nice interface that makes it easy for people to do like wearable tech or something. But then, we didn't have the full expertise on the team in order to make that pivot. So it was, do we want to spend more time and money and energy on pivoting towards this, or do we just, deliver what we got, deliver what we said we would on Indiegogo, or sorry, on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and then be done. And so we sort of decided like to leave it at that. That's not to say that I won't do it again in the future, but just at that point it didn't make sense.
Got it. Okay, thanks. And one last thing. Did you guys have any like loans or grants to do this?
Yeah. I mean, we had a couple of grants from the Alberta government to do that. And yeah, I mean, that's one way of doing a lot of the startup stuff, is getting a lot of grants. Now, the challenge with grants is you can get lulled into a false sense of security. So what I mean by that is you can get grants to start, and you can get grants that match other grants, and you can start developing product. But the problem is, if you keep developing product and you don't have any customers and you keep getting grants, are you really a business? Right. And so I have an analogy, I think, in my thesis where I talk about like, if you had an ice cream shop and you open it up with government grants, and you don't have very many customers coming in, but you have a lot of grant money coming in. And so you make a bunch of different ice cream flavors, and you keep producing really cool ice cream flavors that look interesting, but nobody comes to buy it. Are you really an ice cream shop, or are you just something that's just making ice cream, not selling anybody? Right. So I always think of that in my back of my mind when I think about like startups, right? Like you don't want to take too much government funding because eventually you need to have customers. If you don't have customers, as an ice cream shop, is it better to keep going, not selling ice cream, but making ice cream? Or is it better to close the shop and not make ice cream at all and move to something else? So I think, yeah, it's tricky. Does that answer your question?
Yes. And like, can someone who is giving the grants see that you're not doing anything or not enough to be able to hold yourself up as a business and then not deliver you a grant?
They can see that. Yep. Okay. I mean, you have to kind of report like what you're doing and stuff too, but yeah.
Okay, cool.
Just to build off that question, Teddy, generally when you go and speak to a venture capitalist, they want to see numbers, right? They want to see sales. They want to see how it's going to benefit them, right? In terms of investing their money, what's going to come out of it.
Yep.
Like at what stage, like how do you get to that point where like, do you need to have sales? Like, do you need to have numbers? Like, and then like, how do you get to that point when you're in that such an early stage of, the process?
Yep. That's a great question. So if you noticed in the Lean Canvas, there was a thing called key metrics, right? So if you define what you're going to measure up front and start measuring it from the beginning, or design around measuring it, which is one of the principles of Lean, is to measure and pivot as much as you can, right? So if you're measuring stuff from the very beginning, even if it's small, it doesn't matter, right? So let's talk about StitchKit, right? So in StitchKit, we tracked where the clicks were coming from, who was opening what. And so we had a pretty good idea of like where things were going early on. And we kind of had a good sense of like, what our user base would be to begin with. And then we sort of also tracked the people using it, like what they were doing with it, who were they giving it to, giving us feedback. So, I mean, as long as you track something at the very beginning and you can show some type of growth, that usually helps quite a bit. Because otherwise, you're right, they don't know where this thing is going.
And I guess Indiegogo or something like Kickstarter, I guess to some degree gives them that confidence that, there is a buy-in on the concept, even if the numbers aren't there. Am I correct in saying that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's also the trick with Indiegogo too, right? Is or in Kickstarter as well, you can game it so that if you make the ask low and you get a really good, let's say like you're 100% or 200% or whatever, then you already know that there's interest, right? So from a VC perspective, it looks good to fund something that's funded versus a good idea that has too high of an ask and doesn't get funded, which is kind of what happened with Seyed Scale.
It's almost like initially undervaluing the business to start before. Okay.
Yeah. So like in Slate Scale, for example, that was sort of the first time I had done that kind of work, and the ask was 50K, right? If I were to do it again, we probably should have cut that in half, and it should have been 25, just because we weren't familiar with negotiating and things like that in China. So from the perspective of if I cut it in half and we hit 29K and our goal was 25K, then obviously you're gonna, like, we probably would have continued, right? I mean, from a perspective of, yeah, there's people that want to use it, it's funded, it makes for a nice story, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's a bit of a trick. Cool. Any more questions? Okay, so I guess my last slide, I guess we kind of finished early, which is great, is the one thing I'm hoping you've taken away from today is that, at least the way I think generally, is that research is really about making, and the entrepreneurial side is about making more. So if you go back to this slide, right? So when I think of the research that I do today, so let's say I'm doing some paper for Kai, which is kind of one of the main HCI conferences. You're probably going to do number one, to figure out who's going to use your thing. You're probably going to do number two, what's the research problem I'm trying to solve? Number five, which is what's the thing that makes it unique? And probably number four, which is solution as well. Many of these boxes you kind of already do for HCI and research in general. And then once you want to start making more, you start worrying about who the customers are, and you start worrying about what the cost is going to be and how I'm going to make money off of it. So at the end of the day, for me, really, they're sort of one and the same, research and entrepreneurship, as in it's just one part of it. Like, it's a long spectrum. You're going to do research if you're going to build something, and vice versa. So really, it's about making something, and if you want to make more, it's entrepreneurship. So I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense to everybody?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so that's it. I guess we're done a bit early. If you have any questions or anything like that, you can feel free to email me. Pretty straightforward. I got lucky with my email. It's just teddy@microsoft.com.